Good morning or afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our fourth public workshop on key issues in sponsorship. My name is Eliza Bateman and I'm the Senior Research Analyst at the University of Ottawa Refugee Hub. I believe we have over 430 people attending this morning's workshop from all around the world. We're thrilled to have you all with us. Thank you. Before I provide some context for today's event and introduce our moderator, as this event is convened by the University of Ottawa and as the university sits on unceded Algonquin land, I would like to open the event with our Indigenous Declaration. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home, and we acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old. We honour their courageous leaders, past, present and future. Today's workshop will focus on the connections between community sponsorship and complementary pathways, what exists, opportunities for growth and challenges. As you may know if you've joined us for previous events, this workshop is part of a broader research colloquium that the Refugee Hub is presenting in 2021 with our project partners, the University of Toronto, the Centre for Refugee Studies at York University, and the Institute for Research into Superdiversity at the University of Birmingham. The broad aims of our colloquium are to share knowledge, to foster connection between researchers and practitioners who are doing relevant and important work on sponsorship, and help to shape a forward-looking research agenda. I'd particularly like to thank the Migration Policy Institute for co-hosting this morning's event with us and for sharing members of their talented team to speak with you this morning. We're lucky to welcome Kate Hooper to moderate this workshop, and I will ask Kate to introduce our panel in a moment. But first, let me say a few words of introduction about Kate. Kate is a policy analyst with MPI's international program. Her areas of expertise include the design and implementation of labour migration policies, migration and development, complementary pathways for refugees, and refugee and immigrant integration policies with a focus on Europe and North America. She works closely with MPI's flagship initiative, the Transatlantic Council on Migration, which provides guidance to high-level policymakers on pressing migration and immigrant integration issues. Kate holds an MA with Honours in International Relations from the University of Chicago and a BA in History from the University of Oxford, and she also holds a certificate in International Political Economy from the London School of Economics. Thanks very much, Kate. I'll hand over to you, and I'm very much looking forward to this morning's discussion.
Thank you so much, Eliza, and good morning to everyone who's joined us on the call today. My name is Kate Hooper, and I'll be moderating this very interesting discussion. First, I wanted to plug a recent report that we've had the pleasure of working with the Refugee Hub on at the Migration Policy Institute. This was a report we did for UNHCR on refugee resettlement and complementary pathways, opportunities for growth, and it's available for download on MPI's website. So first, I'm going to run through some quick housekeeping notes. This workshop is a public event and it is being recorded. We'll begin with a discussion among the panelists, which I will moderate, and then we'll open up to a Q&A for our second half. We've got a Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to use this throughout the workshop to add questions that you'd like to hear further discussion on. You can also upvote questions that have been submitted by other people, which will be very helpful for us as we collect these questions and turn them over to the panelists. And then we've also got a chat feature, which is just next to the Q&A function below. This is really for you to use as you wish. So if you want to introduce yourself and where you're joining from, share links to relevant resources, or offer a comment or a question, please feel free to do so throughout the event. So today's workshop, as Eliza said, will really explore how we can apply lessons from refugee sponsorship programs to efforts to create or scale up complementary pathways for refugees, and how these two approaches can work together. We have several panelists on today's call, who I'm very excited to introduce, and so I'll go through them in turn. The first person joining us is Mustafa Alio, who is currently the Managing Director of Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, or RSEAT. RSEAT is an international project that aims to increase refugee inclusion at global policymaking tables within 20 countries around the world. ensuring their equal voice in decisions that affect them. He's also the co-founder and former managing director of Jumpstart Refugee Talent, which has played an intrinsic role in establishing the Economic Mobility Pathways project in Canada. Our other panelist today is Giulio Di Blasi, who is the Europe Director of the Refugee Hub GRSI. He leads their work with European states and institutions to expand sponsorship solutions in Europe. He was formerly the member of cabinet for Federica Mogherini when she served as High Representative for Foreign Affairs for the European Union, and he was responsible for migration and human rights issues. Before that, he worked in the Directorate General of Internal Affairs for the Commission as the head of team for implementing hotspots in Italy and Greece. Susan Fratzke is also joining us today. She is a senior policy analyst with MPI's international program. She leads a lot of MPI's work on forced migration, asylum, and resettlement policy in Europe, North America, and other contexts. Her recent work has focused on avenues to expand solutions for refugees, both by strengthening resettlement projects and exploring opportunities to grow refugee sponsorship programs and complementary pathways. Before Susan joined MPI, she worked for the US Department of State's Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration, and for an adult literacy project that served immigrant and refugee students in Minnesota. Fiona Kendall is up next. She is the European and Legal Affairs Advisor for Mediterranean Hope, which is the migration project of the Federation of Protestant Churches in Italy. They are one of two organizations which really pioneered humanitarian corridors in Italy, which bring people safely to Italy to establish new lives in a supportive context. And they're currently advocating for introducing community sponsorship in Italy. She's based in Rome, and Fiona is a lawyer by training. She's also vice moderator of the Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe, which is a Brussels-based association engaged in research and advocacy work, which draws together numerous denominations and faith-based organizations from across Europe. And finally, we have Michelle Manx on our panel as well. Michelle is the Senior Manager of the World University Service of Canada's Durable Solutions for Refugee Programming, which includes the organization's long-standing Student Refugee Program. This is a youth-to-youth refugee sponsorship initiative, and it's currently the only student-led refugee resettlement program, and it combines community private sponsorship with the provision of tertiary education. Michelle is currently the co-chair of the Global Task Force on Third Country Education Pathways, which promotes and supports the expansion of tertiary education as a complementary pathway for refugees. And in addition to helping develop these new pathways to education and protection for refugees in third countries, Michelle also oversees WUSC's higher education and economic opportunities for refugees work in countries of first asylum and origin. So thank you all so much for agreeing to share your insights on our call today. Quickly before we begin today's discussion, I think it would be helpful for us to unpack a few terms that the audience may hear used on this call. We'll be talking about several different ways to provide access to humanitarian protection. And so I'll just quickly run through these so they're a little bit more familiar as the discussion gets going. The first term is, of course, resettlement. Now, this refers to the selection and transfer of refugees from one country where they've sought protection to a second country that has agreed to admit them as refugees and grant them permanent resident status. This process involves 3 steps, which are often led by UNHCR. First, identifying who requires resettlement worldwide, then assessing individuals' cases for resettlement, and then submitting resettlement cases to countries for consideration based on the quotas set annually. It's worth noting here, of course, that there's a widening gulf between the numbers deemed in need of resettlement and the number of places available. The second term is refugee sponsorship. Now, this can cover several different kinds of programs and policy models, which we'll hear about on our call today. So one example is community-based or private sponsorship, and we'll also hear about humanitarian corridors, which are being used by Italy and France, for example. Very broadly speaking, refugee sponsorship refers to when governments can assign some of their responsibilities for resettlement to private actors, such as civil society organizations or community groups or private individuals. And these responsibilities can include things like identifying or nominating refugees for resettlement, providing financial and logistical support to refugees as they arrive and settle in. These sponsorship schemes vary quite widely on how much responsibility governments decide to assign to other entities. So, for example, the UK scheme focuses on matching public and private funds, whereas Canada's private sponsorship scheme is a model which really fully hands over responsibility to private citizens, both for identifying and nominating refugees for resettlement and supporting them through the resettlement and settlement process. Third term, of course, is complementary pathways. Now, this refers to admission channels such as education, employment, family reunification, or humanitarian visas, which are created or adapted to allow refugees to access them, and which provide access to a longer-term status that protects people from reform on, such as a clear pathway towards permanent residence or citizenship. These pathways might use existing visas with certain adaptations, or they might use a separate humanitarian program. But the idea here is that they're operating separately to resettlement programs and providing another means for refugees to access a durable solution. The refugees who are qualifying for these pathways are being assessed against different criteria. So, for example, if they can get an employer to sponsor them for a work permit or a family member to apply on their behalf of family reunification. But steps are made to ensure that refugees can meet all of the requirements of these programs, and that there are, of course, safeguards to protect them from refoulement if they're first granted a temporary visa. Last two terms, and I'll be very quick, we may also hear the term additionality. Now, this refers to the principle that places offered by complementary pathways or refugee sponsorship programs should be in addition to places offered by government-run resettlement programs. And then finally, we're talking about durable solutions. This is the idea of resolving a refugee's situation permanently, so they can have a permanent legal status with the right to move, to work, to study freely, and crucially move on with rebuilding their lives. So with all of these definitions out of the way, I'm very excited to embark on this discussion with our esteemed panelists. There's a lot happening in this field, both around refugee sponsorship and complementary pathways. You know, just this last week, for example, we saw the US announce that it would pilot a private sponsorship pathway in January. And there's a lot of energy at the moment around introducing and scaling up third country employment and education opportunities. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists about how to capitalize on these connections between these programs and also how to build on this energy. So with that all in mind, and again, please feel free to use the Q&A function throughout this discussion if you want to submit a question. We'll start with a few moderated questions to the panelists. The first question, which I might start by posing to Susan, is how has sponsorship already been incorporated into complementary pathways? And what does this look like in practice across different pathways and programs? And do we see a sort of difference between sponsorship and non-sponsored admissions? Over to you, Susan.
Thanks so much, Kate, and thank you to everyone for being here this morning. It's a pleasure to participate in the conversation. I would just start in terms of my answer to that question by saying that for me, I think it's difficult to envision complementary pathways without sponsorship. I think sponsorship has been a key and integral part to complementary pathways as they've emerged and grown already, although we're starting to, I think, really recognize that in a much more real way in terms of how we build sponsorship into programs intentionally. There are two different ways I think that we've seen sponsorship be incorporated in complementary pathways programs already. One is from a nomination perspective or naming perspective. So in terms of identifying who is actually accessing and connecting with complementary pathways. This is something that has been a key component of private sponsorship as it's been implemented in Canada, but it's also an integral part of existing visa programs that are already used and could be exploited further through complementary pathways programs. So whether we're looking at employment visas, study visas, or family reunification visas and how they can be used by refugees, all of those already require some element of sponsorship in some way in terms of identifying and putting forward someone to access that visa, whether that's a nomination or sponsorship from an employer, from a university, or from a family member. So the actual identification of who accesses this is already a key part of complementary pathways programs. The second way that sponsorship has been built into complementary pathways is with regard to providing integration support. And I think this already connects to the nomination piece that I mentioned. So in many of these visa programs, there's already some sort of an expectation if you've been nominated or sponsored by a particular entity for a visa that there will be some form of support and assistance provided as part of that sponsorship. But we've also seen efforts to make this much more concrete and real and sort of a managed and intentional part of sponsorship within complementary pathways. And there's a lot of interesting initiatives emerging around this in different countries that my colleagues on the panel can speak to in more depth. Just to flag a couple though, we, for example, have seen a partnership emerging now between Reset, which is the community sponsorship organizing body in the United Kingdom, and their emerging labor mobility pathway for refugees, which will seek to facilitate access for refugees to labor migration programs in the UK. And it's an interesting partnership because Reset has come together with this program to enable refugees who enter on labor mobility pathways to connect with sponsors and provide that additional integration support for them. I would also classify the new Sponsor Circle program that you mentioned in the US that was announced this past week for Afghans as sort of an integration partnership within the context of complementary pathways. So Afghans who were admitted through humanitarian parole, which is something like a humanitarian visa in the United States, will be paired when they wish to with sponsorship groups in the United States to provide integration support. And as I said, I think both of these, the nomination component and the integration support component, have been integral pieces of complementary pathways programs from the beginning, and we're just beginning to now sort of recognize them and talk about them much more explicitly, and how they can be, the role of sponsorship can be built out further.
Thanks so much, Susan, and thank you for those examples. I might turn the question next over to Julio and then Mustafa, if you'd like to come in.
Thank you, Kate. I think as Susan was flagging, that I find it extremely interesting for you to say that you can't even disentangle complementary pathways to sponsorship, which is a great way to start. But I would also add that in my view so far, one of the most interesting things that has happened is that sponsorship seems to be a useful complement and solving tool for some of the key challenges around complementary pathways. So if you look at complementary pathways, one of the complexity in a way is that, of course, the way the refugee arrives and the kind of status that the refugee receives on arrival is not necessarily the same status as a vulnerable resettled or as an asylum seeker. So they may not have access to all the kind of integration tools and support that normally are available to refugees coming to a country. In this, the opportunity offered by community sponsorship to solve for some of these integration challenges and support the positive arrival of the refugee is extremely powerful. So you would have a tool that at the welcoming end, regardless of the status of arrival, allows to support the integration, the tailored integration of the person and the family arriving. On top, I would say, if I look at the opportunity to mobilize, I mean, looking a little bit egoistically at the growth of sponsorship, of course, I also believe one of the most interesting intersections is how can complementary pathways represent an incredible opportunity for scaling sponsorship in terms, in particular, of motivating key constituencies. So having students mobilizing, and Michelle, I'm sure will talk to it extensively, having students in universities mobilizing in order to create sponsor groups, having employers using sponsorship as a way to stimulate volunteering within their own company and making it part of the company ethos can be incredibly powerful, not only in terms of course, the integration process in itself and the narrative change, but also in terms of a reservoir of enthusiasm for sponsorship growth overall. So I would see those two dimensions. And maybe as a last comment, one other thing that excites me significantly is how can we, in a way, hybridize and work together alongside, let's say, traditional resettlement and complementary sponsorship, looking at pathways. And what I'm thinking is cases where students and universities can be mobilized, maybe not to welcome a student through a student pathway, but they also can work together with local communities in the city where they are in order to welcome a traditional resettled refugee, or else where local communities can join students in welcoming a student. So I think there is also an opportunity for creativity here and for cross-fertilizing, not necessarily only thinking if it is a labor pathway, then there could be a labor-oriented welcome with a company that organizes the welcome, but you can have immense opportunities for creativity for the company to exploit and to link with the local reality in which the company lives in or the university lives in, and vice versa, creating, I think, even more powerful and interesting narrative opportunities. So those would be my three headlines: sponsorship as a support to integration, regardless of the pathways and regardless of the status, the opportunity offered by pathways to scale sponsorship, and the creativity that can be built around hybrid systems at the welcoming end that support all kinds of pathways.
Thank you, Giulio. That's really helpful, and I think really giving us some food for thought. Mustafa, would you like to come in and add some thoughts?
Thank you. I think great point mentioned by Susan and Giulio, and maybe one of the things that I want to add is just from a refugee perspective, where sponsor or basically complementary pathways played a critical role into empowering refugees themselves to be the future sponsors in different ways. I think what really was interesting in Canada in 1979, when the boat people, the Vietnamese, came to Canada, at that point, there wasn't maybe that much of, let's say, kind of a community engagement. It was mainly of a faith-based organizations that doing the work. But that really what happened with the Syrian movement happened to Canada, and that's basically where we start seeing, like Giulio mentioned, the community coming together, companies. I know a condo building literally in Canada that just got together for the first time ever, and then they crowdsourced funding and then book clubs and all of that. But what really also kind of most inspiring at that point was the Vietnamese, the boat people who became sponsors at that point to the Syrian refugees. And today, the Syrian refugees, you see them in Canada, kind of a crowdsourcing compassion in that sense to go and then sponsors, let's say, Afghan refugees. I want to support one of them. And also one of the other unintended outcomes of the complementary pathways, where they became also an unintended a family reunification process when refugees become basically the sponsors. The other one, like in complementary pathways, is that, let's say, under the economic, for example, one of the other outcomes is actually more support for the refugees, even in hosting states. Because when refugees basically getting resettled here, or in the UK right now, in Australia and Canada on the economic mobility pathway, they have means at this point to even support their families in hosting countries. And this is also kind of improving outcomes. So it always kind of plays a critical role in terms of kind of a win-win for everyone in different directions. And I think also what the last thing I'm going to end on complementary pathways is that it's also a way to see refugees, that the different characters and different situations of refugees, like where refugees are not all vulnerable in a way, because today, before that, or like the system in that sense is that always perceiving refugees as kind of in one brush and one paint and one color, that all vulnerable. And then I always say kind of the system is set up today in a way is like, you know what, like it's about 20 years for a refugee to get resettled. So if you're not the most vulnerable yet, let's just kind of wait for about 20 years. And then, after 20 years, come back, and then we'll see if we can help you in this. I think complementary pathways today try to create process and sees refugees in different lenses. And I think that's also one of the important outcomes or unintended outcomes of the complementary pathways.
Thank you, Mustafa. I think that message of empowerment is really important. So thank you very much. Michelle and Fiona, I was wondering if you could weigh in on these questions about sponsorship and being incorporated into complementary pathways, and also speak about some of the advantages and risks that you've seen from this, from your experience with your own pathways that you work with. Perhaps we could start with Michelle.
Thanks. I think as was mentioned at the beginning, I think complementary pathways is a large topic and encompasses a lot of different types of pathways that are being utilized to provide protection. And I think the MPI report does a really good job of helping to define it. I oversee a couple of initiatives in Canada that use the community sponsorship program, or Canada's private sponsorship of refugees program, to connect refugee youth with higher education opportunities in Canada, but which provides permanent residence upon arrival because they are using the private sponsorship of refugees program. But there are, of course, multiple additional initiatives around the world that are using student visas or labor pathways to connect refugee youth to these types of opportunities. And I think the Canadian one is the only one that leverages a community sponsorship model. And so we've seen some differences between initiatives that use a refugee protection mechanism versus initiatives that use a study visa mechanism or another immigration channel to access these opportunities. I would agree with Julio and others that it is an incredible opportunity to mobilize new networks in refugee protection. It's an opportunity to educate those networks about refugee protection in the country and to engage, in our case, Canadians in that work. And I think that's one of the advantages of using a community sponsorship model, which you don't get when you utilize a different type of pathway. I think one of the biggest advantages of using a community sponsorship model for education pathways and other types of complementary pathways is the provision of a durable status once refugees come to Canada, which comes with the right to work, a sense of stability, a sense of safety, an opportunity to plan ahead, which if you're on a temporary status doesn't allow for. And I think students who come to Canada and elsewhere on a student visa, they'll always have that question in the back of their minds of what happens if I am no longer a student? What happens if something happens in my life and I can no longer be a student? Then what? Do I have to go home? Do I go back to my country of asylum? And so there's a lot of stress that's alleviated for students, I think, when they have that durable status when they arrive. There are challenges with documentation, of course, that we know about, right, that refugees face. And when you're trying to access a traditional, a non-refugee protection, immigration channel, there's all this paperwork and proof of funds and that you need to submit, which is not required when you are applying for resettlement or for refugee protection in another country. And then that burden and onus is on the sponsor rather than on the refugee person themselves. And we found that really helpful in facilitating our workplace linked sponsorship initiatives. There's pros and cons of each. It's also less costly. So if refugee youth are coming to Canada on a community sponsorship, they are treated as Canadian students when they arrive. So the cost of tuition is much less, and they're able to, because they have the rights of a Canadian citizen and permanent resident, they're able to support themselves throughout the process. So what that does for us is that allows us to sponsor more students over time, because after the first year, students have access to all of the funding that Canadians have access to. So that's one of the other advantages. I started to mention about access to services, right? So as a permanent resident, you have access in Canada to healthcare. So again, if something should happen, if you need a liver transplant or you have a brain tumor, as we've seen with students, you can have access to healthcare in Canada. And even if your studies are interrupted, you can eventually go back to your studies. You get the care that you need, and then you go back to your studies, which I think is a really important protection and safeguarding element of using community sponsorship. I think it's important to be transparent and open about the cons, though, in using community sponsorship to facilitate education pathways or labor pathways, as our initiatives do. I think they're still highly reliant on coordinated efforts. And many of the initiatives that we know about who are facilitating education pathways are using our coordinated efforts. So I think the MPI report has identified 22 different coordinated initiatives, but we know that many, many more students could be able to access a student visa, or young people are able to access a labor pathway if the barriers associated with those pathways would be unlocked for refugee youth. And so what I find about community sponsorship, using community sponsorship for those pathways, is that it limits scale and it limits the global scope of initiatives, and it limits refugees' ability to access these pathways on their own. And I think the last thing I'll say about that is that it also, they still fall under a country's refugee protection commitments. So even in Canada, even though private sponsorship is considered a complementary pathway to state-led resettlement, it still falls under Canada's refugee protection mechanisms. And there's a target for refugees, and then there's a target for students and workers. And even though refugee students are accessing academic and employment opportunities, they're being counted as refugees as opposed to international students and skilled workers. So I think that's something that we can address potentially in the future. And I'll pass it over to Fiona, I guess, or back to Kate.
Thank you, Michelle. Fiona, do you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Mustafa, for just also reminding us where Canada was at in 1979, because I sometimes feel as though Italy is currently where Canada was back in 1979, in the sense that much of the private sponsorship that's happening here is being carried out by faith-based organisations with one or two notable exceptions. And so it might be helpful just to say a little bit about the Italian context and how private sponsorship has devolved here, and to highlight the difference between private sponsorship and community sponsorship, because both things are happening in tandem in Italy, even within the ambit of the Humanitarian Corridors programme, which, as Kate mentioned, is the programme that my organisation has been involved in since 2015. At that point, we began the programme with the Comunità di Sant'Egidio, which is a Catholic organisation, to bring people from Lebanon to Italy. And it was the first time that a scheme of that kind had been piloted in Italy, and the pilot was to bring 1,000 people safely over to Italy, to be supported entirely by civil society organisations, our own and Sant'Egidio. But within that memorandum of understanding, we have chosen to operate the programme in different ways. And so in our own model, we are hosting people independently. They're supported by professional caseworkers. And the engagement that we have with the community is more peripheral, in the sense that it is all about supporting integration, but the community is not directly engaged in the hosting of the people who come through the programme. Whereas in the Sant'Egidio model, and in the model that's now devolved by Caritas, which is operating corridors from other places and to other places, there the parishes, local parishes, are directly involved in hosting and are engaged more directly in the support of the people who come. And you might ask why that is, and I suspect that there are historic and cultural reasons for that. But if I say to you that Italy is a Catholic country with a third of the population declaring itself to be practicing, having a system which engages parishes that notionally would be 16 million people is possible. Whereas for a Protestant entity, which makes up about 300,000 people in the entire Italian population, the network just isn't there to harness. And so I guess at the outset, it didn't occur to us that we would deal with this in that way. The advantage of being where Canada was in 1979 is that we have the benefit of looking at all of that vast experience that has built up since that time, and understanding the potential benefits of community sponsorship, some of which Michelle has set out. And I think it's fair to say that we would now like to engage our communities much more directly and feel that we are learning a lot about how to do that effectively. I think what I would say in terms of risks is that our perception here in Italy is that private sponsorship has been a fantastic way to engage civil society, and more people want to get involved. But in a sense, these programs have become victims of their own success. And what we perceive is that increasingly there is a reliance on private sponsorship programs by government to discharge what we would say are essentially governmental responsibilities to look after refugees. And so there is a discussion to be had about how that responsibility can be better shared, because we don't want to lose the engagement of local communities. Indeed, we would like to strengthen it, and we want to continue to harness that goodwill, but we would like to see government continuing to be involved and indeed stepping up its engagement in refugee sponsorship. So I would endorse everything that the panelists have said, but certainly within an Italian context, we're perhaps at a point where we have to be just a bit thoughtful about how we scale up and what that means in terms of the different responsibilities of the different stakeholders who are involved.
Thank you, Fiona. That's a fascinating point about how to weigh up who should be assigned these responsibilities. So I think to pick up on your point about the parishes, we've heard about a number of stakeholder groups that are involved in different sponsorship initiatives. And so I was wondering, Susan, if you could speak more broadly about the sort of key networks and stakeholder groups that you think really need to be involved to make sponsorship a success.
Sure. I think Giulio had also raised his hand if he wanted to make a quick reply on Fiona's point. I'm happy to give the floor to him first.
I just wanted to take 1 millisecond on something that Michelle and Fiona have said that I found very interesting. I think hearing you, Michelle, speaking about the challenges of community sponsorship and the risk of tightening the bottleneck in the scalability, I think you were referring, just for me to be sure in framing it, to the issue with naming. So in a way, you need to have someone that would name you as a student to come to Canada. And that creates, of course, potential challenges in terms of scalability, because you would need to have the groups in order then to be able to name the persons. And what I wanted just to refer as a very exciting, I think, avenue that has been developed in Italy is that within the university corridors in Italy, actually the program defines a number of students and they can self-apply in the program, which I find incredibly exciting as well in terms of refugee agency. That is the students themselves that apply in the program. And then there are the selection missions, and then they are welcomed into a community group in parts of the program. But I just wanted to reflect on this different agency and starting point for the work, whether it's the refugee self-starting, wanting to join a program, or the naming program. And they are very, very different in terms of constituents, even though both fall within the broader framework of the education pathways. But just I wanted to reflect on it. And in particular, I think on the very exciting work that the colleagues in Italy are doing in terms of this opportunity for agency for refugees to join in the program by applying rather than having to be pre-selected or named or, let's say, be on the receiving end of the pathway.
Thanks, Giulio. Michelle, Fiona, please wave if you want to quickly respond on that. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Susan. Oh, Mustafa, do you want to jump in?
Yes, there was a really critical point that was mentioned by Fiona on Italy, and basically just to be cautious in terms of, that we need to keep engaging government to take on their responsibilities and bringing refugees and not kind of to rely more on private sponsorship or kind of the community. And to be honest, this is a very sensitive topic to me, at least as a refugee, or, as I still have a lot of family in different countries and all of that, and just kind of looking at what happened in the world. A few years ago, we were talking, the whole world was outraged because only less than 1% of refugees get resettled. then, despite all the advocacy, that number declined to be less than 5%, less than 0.5%. So 0.5%. And even though many people start continuing to say it's less than 1%, and not many actually were saying it was actually 0.4. And with the continuous outrage in that, also we're seeing after COVID that less than 0.1%. So it just, I don't know if it can even go lower than that in the future. And that being said, and it's always that kind of a conversation. Do I want to really spend so much time on trying to engage a failing system to say that take on your responsibility and then maybe kind of not empower and increase numbers through complementary pathways? It's a very valid point. I don't know, to be honest. Sometimes like it really kind of a lot of confliction between the moral and the survival kind of a process. However, I'm going to mention one thing. In Canada, there was a survey that was really interesting provided by McGill and UFT a few years ago, and it says, are we good or are we lucky? In this survey, one of the interesting findings at that point was basically 1 out of 8 Canadians was either a sponsor or knew someone who sponsored refugees in that sense. And I think on the long run, that mechanism of involving community on the ground and involving citizens will inevitably change that political scheme in the future to be more receptive toward refugees. And maybe we can utilize those kind of complementary pathways into a tool for the long run to increase government responsibility and not to forget it. And again, just keep this as an additionality. So I think the word additionality, well, every time we talk about this, it's very important to have a conversation with government. But I think also what really disappointing to me is that sometimes I see a lot of advocates where kind of, they want to stop complementary pathways, just kind of to put the governments under pressure that you need to take a lot more responsibility. And I think that's where I need to be cautious at in that sense, because at one point, the outcomes, that's what the most important thing to many refugees is that at the end, we need to be resettled in that sense. And okay, I'm going to bring it back to the point. It's also, at least to me, the most a powerful tool of the complementary pathway is the empowerment tool to refugees, where they become the future sponsors or they become the future basically advocate toward that. I also kind of, I wanted to mention, I forgot now, I just remember that I know of a few examples in Canada where people who are super white-wing and they were, not welcoming to refugees, the second they start having a refugee family next to them or they get involved, they change their mind completely in that sense. And I think that's kind of where and it's an unfortunate, but I think it's the only tool I have, which is kind of to play the long-term goal or a game, not kind of to play the short-term one.
Thank you, Mustafa. If Michelle and Fiona don't want to jump in, you can just raise your hand if you want to jump in. Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Susan with that question about some of the networks that need to be in place to make this a success. I think we've heard numerous examples from the panel so far on the types of stakeholder groups that they're engaging, plus, of course, refugees themselves.
Thanks, Kate. And I will just briefly reply also to what Mustafa said, because I think it's really an excellent point, and I think speaks to one of the other risks that we haven't talked about yet in terms of community sponsorship or sponsorship more generally and resettlement, which is, we've talked about the potential for outsourcing government responsibilities, but there's also, a lot of times concerns raised about this idea of cherry picking, or that resettlement, which is supposed to be a tool for supporting the most vulnerable groups, then becomes supplanted by complementary pathways, which are a way for governments to really pull out the most skilled refugees or those who are most likely to integrate, however you define that. And there's, I think, tension there in how we talk about them, but I do think that Mustafa's point about playing the long game and looking at how complementary pathways can perhaps support, help to build public support for refugee admissions more broadly is a really important one to keep in mind. And I think in addition to all of the excellent points that Mustafa made about how it shifts people's perceptions around refugees and moving beyond sort of the sum of their vulnerabilities, there's also that individual connection, and that individual connection we know from from broader thinking around around public opinion and narratives and immigration, people really perceive these things through their own individual stories and experiences. And once they have the opportunity to, to either build an individual connection with someone after they arrive, but I think also, the Afghanistan situation is a good example. Once they, see someone they know or someone who's a friend of a friend who they know who is in need, and have the opportunity to help them and become involved in the system in that way, that can also really open eyes about what's involved in refugee resettlement and the challenges refugees face. I know we've heard from, in the US context, for example, that sponsors who become involved in co-sponsorship here in the US, in some cases, it's the very first time that they've really had to interact with social services systems and see how incredibly difficult it is to apply for benefits and how limited those benefits are. And when all of a sudden this is, someone who is, a friend of their friend who is a veteran who is in Afghanistan, who is unable to really get the assistance that they need to enroll their kid in school or to access healthcare benefits, all of a sudden this all becomes much more real. So I think that individual personalized experience is also a part of building this longer term narrative. But sorry, Kate, to get back to your question.
All great points, thank you.
To say briefly on stakeholder networks, we've heard a lot of really great examples already. I think I'd just pick up on a few points. One is that, as we've already heard, sponsorship is an important way to engage broader communities and in resettlement. And that is even more the case when we're talking about it in the context of complementary pathways. It's not just an opportunity, but it's an imperative as part of these programs. And it depends a bit on, which complementary pathway you're talking about. When it comes to employment, of course, you have to engage businesses and employers, but I think, you have to be a bit creative about how you're reaching out. There's been a lot of good experiences that maybe Mustafa can speak to in Canada, for example, using local economic development networks and programs to reach out to individual employers. So this isn't just about, reaching out to Marriott or Uniqlo or some of these large employers, but actually really figuring out how you get down into particular sectors and particular localities that are looking for broadening and then diversifying their labor pool. Of course, universities are essential when we're looking at student programs, but here, and Michelle can speak to this more. But I think you're talking about multiple layers of people within the university and education structure. University administrations are critical, especially the higher level of university administrations. They're the ones who have the opportunity to really, give an impetus to education programs, and also to dedicate funding when we're talking about things like scholarships. International students offices within universities are also essential because they have knowledge and resources to help navigate some of these visa processes. If you're talking about sponsorship programs that use student visas, and of course, students themselves, both in terms of being sponsors, but also in advocating and lobbying for these types of initiatives within their own administrations. And the WUSC model is a great example of even relying on students as sources of funding even. I think the other group that we need to talk about is networks, though, in first asylum countries as well. It's important for refugees to be able to know about and access these programs, and there, you need to have the appropriate connections to actually share information, but also support people through the application process and direct them. Agency is of course critical, but people need to have information to make decisions and information about where to sort of dedicate their resources. So not saying that someone needs to be playing the UNHCR role of deciding who goes where, but simply having good sources of information and information about how to apply for programs is critical. For all of those things, whether you're talking about employers, universities, networks in first asylum countries, I think we have to also be aware that these are very context specific networks that have to be built. So we have to be reaching out to the right actors within first asylum countries, the right NGOs who have information about the qualifications and interests of different refugee populations. And those might be NGOs or local community organizations that are outside the traditional networks that we work in with in the context of resettlement. And the same thing is true for, of course, reaching out to employers and universities, really going beyond that sort of top level, the big name universities, big name employers, and being very targeted, and also being targeted in terms of the language that we're using. breaking out of sort of the constraints of the humanitarian terminology that dictate that sort of occupies the resettlement space, and knowing how to actually talk to different types of stakeholders is critical. The last point that I would just make is that, as others have said, governments have to be a part of this process. That's important in terms of thinking about balances of responsibilities. But what we've heard in the report that Kate had mentioned at the top, but also in other work we've done, is that actors, private actors who are coming in to support these programs, feel a lot more comfortable in many cases when they have some sort of imprint or some sort of indication that the government is actually behind these programs. It really reduces the sense of risk, whether that's political risk, if you're a university or a business, you don't want to stick your neck out on something that seems like it might generate a lot of public backlash. There's also risk in terms of the visa processes. If you are going to be using a student or employment visa and you go through all of the process of sponsoring someone, and you find out that the consular officer in the host country doesn't have the information about this program and is going to make a split-second decision that this person doesn't qualify, you've invested a lot of resources in that. So having some sort of risk reduction factor is really important, and governments can also play a really important role in disseminating information on these programs, and also, I would say, perhaps a bit controversially, as co-funders in some ways. Complementary pathways and sponsorship programs, as Michelle said, there's advantages to doing these in decentralized ways that can be very accessible, but also require a lot of coordination, can require coordination or benefit from coordination, and there's a role in some cases, I think, for governments to play there in supporting that aspect of the program.
Thanks, Susan. That's a really helpful overview. I might turn it over to the rest of the panel. I'd also be interested in hearing from you guys about your experience of engaging with these different groups, if you can bring in some examples from your own context. If you want to raise a hand, otherwise I will turn it over to Michelle, who I think was nodding the hardest out of the group during Susan's intervention, and then we can open it up to everyone else. Michelle?
Sure, yeah, I would agree with everything that Susan said. And something that you said, Susan, made me think about when you said risk reduction, something that I think we've observed with different stakeholders, workplaces and universities in Canada are reluctant to take on the risk of being a sponsor and the legal requirements of what that means for sponsors. And so, which is different than if you're using a study or if refugees are accessing employment visas on their own. There's not that same level of responsibility. And so in Canada, post-secondary institutions themselves are not the sponsors. It's a group of individuals within an institution. And in our case, often the primary contacts or the primary sponsors happen to be students. And we see a greater willingness of students to take on that legal responsibility than the staff of an institution, because they're playing a role within the institution and they don't want to personally be responsible for a sponsorship. And then one of the number one questions that we receive from the schools when we approach new schools to participate is, what are the legal implications of us becoming sponsors? So that might be a limiting factor. And then just one thing to add in terms of key stakeholders that I think need to be involved or that have contributed to our success is in Canada is the training organization. So Canada has the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program, which supports sponsorship agreement holders and provides training to them and their constituent groups. And WUSC has a similar training program for our student groups to help manage expectations. And I think it's a really critical part if we think about using community sponsorship as a tool for changing mentalities, having more open and positive perceptions of refugees. You need a private sponsorship or a community sponsorship or any kind of complementary pathway to go well, otherwise it will have the opposite effect. And so part of that is training sponsorship groups, sponsoring institutions, and then also on our side, at least, training refugee students and helping manage their expectations and prepare them for whatever opportunity is that they're seizing in Canada. So in our case, we do multiple months of pre-departure training with refugee students to prepare them for their academic experience, but also to prepare them for the cultural differences and academic differences and workplace, differences that they'll face in Canada. A little bit.
Thank you, Michelle. Julia, do you want to go next?
Yes, thanks a lot. And thank you, Susan. It was a great introduction to this point. I wanted to start with one even bigger point. We have been running a lot of surveys in different countries on that we're asking, among many questions, would you be ready to form a sponsor group and to welcome a refugee? And there is a relatively consistent figure of 20 to 30% of society replying, I would be ready to welcome and to create and to form a sponsor group, which makes an incredible potential in terms of overarching numbers. So you would have millions of Germans, millions of Italians, millions of French that in a survey would be ready to start this off. And then you look at the actual figures and if you would get to 0.01% of the population at this stage, would be already quite a success. So sponsorship is characterized by enormous friction between the potential and the willingness and the actual ability to actually do it and to form a group and to activate and to move. And I think both Michelle and Susan were speaking to something that I constantly characterize now in how do we reduce that friction? So how do we match that enormous potential with the actual reality? And I think several points were already raised that are super important. First, you need to make it as seamless, something extremely complex like transferring a refugee from a third country to a country of asylum, as seamless as possible for the user. You can't expect to reach scale if that is not seamless for an organization that is not doing this as a first job. So for a university, this is not the only thing they do. For an employer, this is not the only thing they do. So it needs to be as seamless as possible to reach as much scale as possible. The second thing that I think is super important is to reduce operational friction. So another thing that is typical, I think, more in the world of labor than on students, but I'm sure Michelle probably can refer to it as students as well, is it can't take 1 year for the person to move. Because if the operational friction is too strong, you will lose interest either by the employer or by the university or by the welcoming group. So you need to reduce operational friction. And third, you need to provide constant and consistent support. We have been running a lot of surveys. Colleagues of Refugee 613 have been running a lot of surveys in Canada, in particular in the context of the embryonic project. And one of the things that was emerging consistently is that one of the key factors that moved people to actually join a sponsor group was the feeling of being supported. And that's something that we feel is a cross-country reality. So I think that these three things: make it seamless, reduce operational friction, provide consistent support, are incredibly important. And to those, I would add that one thing that we have not cracked, and again, I think Michelle, partly they have cracked it in WUSC, and I find it super interesting how they figured it out, is the sustainability of the financial model. So one of the key challenges in order to scale is how do we provide all of this seamlessness, support, reduced friction in a world where this is not generating funding and it's not generating resources by itself. And there needs to be external resources coming in, be them from the state, which is a possibility, or from the private sector. So finding ways to generate sustainable funding model is incredibly important for the scaling of the program. I would just want to add one thing that I heard from Mustafa that I think it's incredibly important, is the point on playing the long game. I couldn't agree more that when we look at the concepts of additionality and all the discussions we have, one of the largest points is that I always say that sponsorship has the incredible potential of providing additional protection space in a political sense. And that in the current circumstances is at least on a very personal level, one of the main motivating factors, while I believe this is an incredibly powerful instrument, in societies where protection space is quickly shrinking, building a coalition of individual citizens that are ready to stand up for protection, not only by speaking about it, but by taking action, is one of the most powerful ways where we can rebuild a larger protection space, a more depolarized discussion around migration, and play the long game, which is where ultimately I think we are all in need of change. So thanks a lot, and passing it on back to you, Kate.
Thank you, Giulio. Some really good points about scaling and how to bridge that gap. Mustafa and Fiona, I wanted to ask if this resonates with you so far, if there are any points that you wanted to add from the other panelists that you've heard.
Yes, absolutely. I would endorse what's been said, and I'm just, smiling as I hear Giulio, because I've written down, what are the challenges that we encounter with these networks, with developing programs like this. And one of them is about who's doing the preparing of the sponsors for sponsorship, because that's absolutely fundamental to the success of any scheme. Who is going to accompany them? Because there needs to be that feeling of being supported. Who is going to monitor them, and who is going to fund all of that, which I think is, in essence, a lot of what Giulio was suggesting. In Italy, we're in a situation where we don't have a system of community sponsorship, at least not in a structured form as yet. And so these are some of the issues that we're grappling with at the moment. And it's going to be interesting to see how that works out. And I know at a later stage we may go on to discuss where the future of community sponsorship lies. But I think unless we can tackle these 4 questions, we're not going to get the buy-in from community groups that we need, because people, the willingness is there, but people do need to feel that they are supported on that process.
Thanks, Fiona.
I think the only point I'm going to add, yes, unfortunately today, in my opinion, one of the biggest barrier in a way of, let's say, kind of innovative pathways for refugees and resettlements are the bureaucratic process within government. It's just kind of, how fast can we get people in? Like, for example, even when we talk to employers back in Canada, and then, when Jumpstart got on board the first 3 ever employers, we couldn't get big employers at that point because they wouldn't wait for an unknown time or kind of for a year or something. Actually, we relied on partners that we built a relationship with for a long time, and just kind of, tried to work it with them and just get them in. However, right now, I mean, with for example, the employment and see with the Complementary Pathways, and Canada making announcements for 500, we start seeing a lot of companies that would come and say, like, I would hire 30, I would hire 50. In UK, we've seen kind of about 40 to 50 refugees arrived with a health background. But I think the idea at that point, if employer has to wait for a year, we were able to get some employers that even willing to pay for that, because then kind of sourcing talent. So this even it might become a source of fund and resources generation to support more refugees. But at the same time, only if that can stay within, the few months of a process, or even with private sponsorship, you would see a lot of people, saying that I'm interested, but then, me who is interested today might be different than me in 2 years from now or 3 years from now, gonna wait for that refugee to arrive. So I hope, and like Fiona said initially, is that maybe there is a lot from the international community to learn from the gaps on this program, where Canada started in 1979 officially. And by the way, Canada also did that in 51 with the Hungarians refugees, but kind of a more officially in 1979. Is that for other countries and bodies to maybe try to acknowledge those gaps and address them in a way in terms of the process and all of that. And I think that's kind of, what I very hopeful that other states would do and other parties would do.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. So we're getting some questions coming through on the Q&A. I feel like I could listen to our discussion all day long, but just to plug to the audience that if you do have any questions, please use the Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. You can type a question in there and we'll go and try and answer it in the time allocated. You can also add comments to the chat function. So please do keep that in mind as you're listening to the discussion. So we've just had a question come in about humanitarian corridors. So I might start with this one. So from David Telesky, he asks, humanitarian corridors in Italy, France, and Belgium depend on MOUs signed with governments and required continued negotiation to secure their renewal to sustain the projects. In Canada, the various sponsorship programs were formalized by the 1976 Immigration Act. Do you think that formalization in national or EU legislation would be helpful for their sustainability, either of humanitarian corridors or other complementary pathways? So that's one question that I might pose. Perhaps, Julia, would you like to start by taking that one?
I think Fiona should take that first, and
Fiona?
I would be happy to complement.
Okay.
Sure, thank you. Great question, and it's an issue that we're thinking about right now. Because the person who posed the question is quite right. It has been entirely ad hoc. It's been an organic process, the development of different humanitarian corridors across Europe. And there is an anxiety on the part of the organisations that are involved in that about the lack of transparency in that process. And also how it excludes smaller organisations from getting involved. If you require to make a direct negotiation with government, it helps if you are a large organisation with a bit of political or financial clout behind you. It's much more difficult if you are a small organisation or a small group of people. Enshrining it in law, whether that be primary legislation or secondary legislation, I think would have the great advantage of clarity about the parameters of the programme, as well as transparency about the process for accessing or establishing such a programme. I think there's then a perhaps more challenging question about what's the right piece of legislation or the right type of legislation to address that. And I think that will probably depend on the political and legislative culture within each country. But yes, I think in general, I would endorse the suggestion that there should at least be some normative provision that gives people a degree of clarity about the scope and procedure for accessing such programmes. Julio, I'm sure you can add to that.
Not really, because you said it all. No, I maybe just add to counterbalance what Fiona said, that I share 100%. So is on a positive counterbalancing. It's just to say, I think one of the incredible things that have happened in the humanitarian corridor schemes is the incredible flexibility and the ability for CSOs to play such a proactive role, which is not obvious. I mean, there are schemes that have been born very bureaucratic in the context of strong frameworks that have not allowed, because of that initial hyperstructuring, the same level of degree of flexibility and debureaucratization that have allowed the humanitarian corridors to scale significantly. At the same time, scale without a framework, I think, is challenging by itself. So at a certain point, this incredible creativity needs a framework in order to be able to continue scaling. And I think that's where we are in several programs. I would just add that in the case of Belgium, actually, there is now a program of community sponsorship in Belgium, specifically created and established in itself. So it's a little bit different from France and Italy. And as Fiona was saying, I think every country will have its own way of structuring the humanitarian corridors experience in a more in a framed way that allows for its scalability. And of course, we are glad to be working with CSOs and governments in Italy, in France, in other countries, in order to look how this can be done, again, in a way that doesn't stifle the incredible innovation that humanitarian corridors have been bringing along.
Thank you, Julia. Susan, do you want to come in?
Just to pick up on one last piece of the question, which I think I was asking specifically about the role of the EU and whether or not EU legislation on this would be particularly helpful. And I guess my personal view on that aspect is that while, as I completely agree with Julio and Fiona, that having some sort of structuring framework is really important, I have doubts about whether or not having that at the EU level would really be helpful or the right approach, not to mention the fact that we're already caught in so many controversial discussions right now at the EU level around both resettlement and asylum, and I'm not sure that trying to push forward a legislative framework is going to be the most helpful thing right now. That being said, I think the EU has an incredibly important role to play in disseminating information about programs, raising the profile of programs, and DG Home has been very active on this in the last year. Also, I think providing funding for pilot initiatives, which they've also been doing. So I think important role for the EU, but really focused on supporting the operations and dissemination of programs rather than necessarily carving out a legislative framework.
Thank you so much. So another question. Sorry, yes, Mustafa.
Sorry, it just one small point where I also kind of agree with Susan on this, but I just, with formalization, it's simple, yes. But I think maybe just kind of to bring the perspective, I mean, Europe is a way more advanced, let's say, than the other regions when it comes to humanitarian corridors. And I think it just, one of the things that always comes to my mind, in my opinion, would be better to leverage actually municipalities' work in Europe, because we've seen a lot more progressive kind of a mindset and programming coming from different municipalities in Europe. And I would feel if we take the approach of the cities and municipalities might be a lot more effective actually than going through the commission.
Thank you. Giulio, did you want to respond?
Yes, I mean, this is one of my most exciting topics is municipalities and local authorities. And I just want to flag, I saw in the long list of attendees today, Anna Gregory, who has just joined our team at the Refugee Hub and who's going to be leading the work on municipalities and local authorities engagement. So hi, Anna, just to acknowledge your presence in particular on this topic. And I just wanted to say, yes, municipalities and local authorities are incredible potential supporters and sustaining factors for community sponsorship. And that's something we are pursuing actively. However, on the other side, what we are constantly finding is how difficult it is for a local authority to actually find its role within the sponsorship model, unless it's framed within a larger policy framework that is established at national level. So one of the hard things is how do we match the strong progressive nature of a lot of local authorities wanting to do more with a framework that allows them to play a role, including in recruiting sponsors, including in potentially as well providing, for instance, housing for sponsor groups. So there is a wealth of possibilities for local authorities to activate around. But again, as always, there needs to be some degree of a framework very often in order for that enthusiasm and willingness to act to be effective. So once again, I think we go back to the framework question and what we were discussing before.
Thank you, Giulio. So another question that has come through on the Q&A is from Emilia Bratanova. She says, all speakers have spoken and underlined the complementarity between community sponsorship and complementary pathways. However, in countries where there isn't any of these in place, what would you recommend to start with? Which one could be better suited? Could you weigh in on that? Does anyone want to raise their hand to jump in? Okay, I saw Giulio's hand first, and then Michelle, and then Susan.
No, mine was last, so I don't want to.
Oh, okay. It looks like it kind of waved across my screen.
No, I saw a sort of a contemporaneity between Susan and Michelle, but I was certainly last.
Okay. Michelle, do you want to go first?
Sure. I think that's a really good question. I've been talking especially about how you can use community sponsorship to facilitate education pathways, but most of the other initiatives around the world are using student visa pathways. And Canada used student visas or other immigration channels before it began sponsoring students through the private sponsorship of refugees program. So our work sponsoring refugee students long predates the implementation of the private sponsorship of refugees program and our ability to use that as the mechanism to provide more durable solutions for refugees. And I think a really interesting example of that is in Mexico, which does not resettle refugees, but is facilitating access to education and a third country solution for refugees through their study visa programs. And I think that Julio had mentioned something about, the influence and the power of citizens when they are engaged in refugee issues, and the snowball effect that can have on government commitments for state-led resettlement, or aid, development assistance related to refugee issues. And I think post-secondary institutions are, at least in the Canadian context, are very influential members of their communities, and in the Canadian context at a federal scale. So I think it has the opportunity to influence policy changes that are needed to facilitate greater access for refugees.
Thank you, Michelle. Susan, did you want to come in on that?
And partly to echo what Michelle said, I mean, I think private sponsorship or sort of humanitarian visa channels are a great and flexible tool that can help to expand complementary pathways and community sponsorship where they exist. And it's I think been very exciting to see this emerge in the last year in the United States, and it's going to be a really valuable tool in the US in terms of opening complementary pathways. But it's not it's not a necessity. As Michelle said, many of the programs that exist already, most of the programs are actually using existing employment or study visas or family reunification to actually begin to facilitate access to complementary pathways. So there are existing visa tools that can be used. The challenge is, of course, all of the frictions that Julia mentioned around using these for refugees, very much not frictionless. That being said, in places where we've seen this emerged, I think one approach that's been really valuable is using these sorts of pilot and test cases. In the mapping that we did in looking at legal frameworks, which Refugee Hub was very instrumental in, one of the things that's clear is that in many, not all, but in many visa programs, there are a lot of flexibilities. In some cases, there are really hard barriers, but there are often flexibilities that come down to the individual information that consular officers have when making decisions. And there are ways to make visas work for these existing visas work for refugees with a lot of facilitation and support. And that's not a model that can necessarily be sustainable or scalable, but it's a foot in the door and a way to begin to explore how these visas can be used and start a conversation both with partners within business or within universities or students about what sorts of roles or they might play, and sort of demonstrate the ability of refugees to qualify for these programs, because there's still a lot of misconception around refugees' skills and value that they bring. And it's also a way to start a conversation with government around what types of broader flexibilities might be built into programs and in what ways. So there's existing visa pathways that can be used, and the best way to start is to try to begin to pilot these on an individual basis, which will be very difficult, but can at least launch a process and launch a conversation.
Thanks, Susan. Mustafa, would you like to jump in?
Yes. And I don't know how controversial that would be, but let me kind of start with one thing to acknowledge, and kind of a point alluded to in the beginning. Refugees absolutely are among the vulnerable group. They need the support, and many countries, when they do that, including kind of a refugee resettlement, all of this, it's more of a legal and a moral a responsibility. But there is always another side to it. And this is kind of always where you see some people getting a bit uncomfortable and just, I want to get to the point, how can we advocate for this? When we start working on the economic mobility pathways, we did not go to companies and say, you should resettle refugees or give a job offer to refugees because, you have to be morally responsible in the community. The idea was like, you are looking for talent and give us the hardest talent that you want it to fill, and refugee would be able to do it. So thinking, and this also kind of what boggles my mind. The first thing I learned coming to the global north, as we always kind of, a lot of people want to say it, is that, with every problem, there is an opportunity. However, only with refugees, it just stays as a problem. We only talk about them as a problem, as a burden, as all of that. but not many people start talking about refugees as an opportunity. And this is kind of one of the things that every time when I go is like, I'm a refugee, talk about me as an opportunity, that's fine. And this is what maybe the conversation, because I do know that some countries, if they are on the right wing or they are kind of have that kind of a practical, I mean, at the end, if states or stakeholders are racist, they would not go and say like, I'm racist, I don't want to bring refugees. So economic burden is always kind of one of the, you know, the star of all the excuses in that point when we talk about refugees. But then what if we talk about refugees, for example, to Italy as, you know, maybe one of the most Asian countries in the planet that, you know, you can think of refugees as a source of keeping this country alive. You can think of refugees as a source to a demographic distribution problem in Canada. You can think of refugees as a source of, you know, the employment, the positions that you have. And I think we go back to this, you know, the survey, which I like, is like, are we good and are we lucky? And actually it's both. When countries, and I think that's kind of the conversation that needs to be changed a bit. Often most advocates, when they talk about refugees and they want to kind of support refugees, they always talk only about them in a humanitarian lens. But I think we need also to empower and kind of, you know, increase the tools we have ourselves when we talk about refugees to create a balance. So it's not zero-sum game. It's not either economic, it's not, you know, either economic or a humanitarian. It's actually both. So when people do support refugees, yes, you're doing good, but don't fool yourself. You're getting something in return. In the US, there was actually a research that came from a department with the Trump administration refused to publish it, that basically refugees in the last 10 years brought $63 billion more in basically profit, more than what they took in services. So that's basically where also this kind of the conversation that often missed. And I think if we, you know, bring this conversation and educate ourselves about this conversation, I think we can achieve a greater results in states or countries that they don't have any of those programs yet.
Thank you, Mustafa. That's a really important point. Julio, do you want to come in? I saw you raise your hand earlier.
Sure. On two things. First, to completely agree with Mustafa, and I think even more so, one of the things that I find most important at this stage is how can we transfer refugees' agency on refugee pathways as much as possible. Again, what I was saying before about Unicore and the ability to self-apply, and more broadly, I think that's just an example of a process that needs to happen, which is decentralize and provide refugees direct agency to shape which will be their own decisions and pathways. As a general framing and a general process. And just today I was with colleagues here in Italy, and also in Italy, I think the latest survey was that in terms of migrants writ large, so this is not only refugees, but migrants in Italy contribute to 9 to 12% of the Italian GDP structurally, with some regions peaking around 17 to 20. So just to absolutely agree with everything Mustafa has just said. And maybe going back to the original question, I frankly don't see, I mean, we work a lot in policy design with governments, and I don't think there is a contradiction between developing a policy on a pathway or developing a policy on sponsorship and needing to start from one or the other, in the sense that very often you can if there is a political interest to start working on a pathway for students, you can always have as a dimension of that pathway a sponsorship welcome at the arrival point, or as you create a sponsorship program because there is a wider interest in society to mobilize citizens and create welcoming opportunities, you can link it to the development of a dedicated student pathway. So I would say that there is no need to choose in the policy design. You have the potential to go both ways and achieve both sponsorship welcome and complementary pathways in a way at the same time. What I would argue, though, is that one of the greatest challenges that I think we are facing in the even resettlement space writ large is the major gap between political will and actual state resources devoted to it. So in very many cases at national level, the number of people that are working on resettlement, complementary pathways, community sponsorship will be 2 to 3. Canada is a massive exception to it for obvious reasons. But in several countries, you will have very, very small administrative officials, groups of administrative officials that need to juggle all of these priorities, from moving people out of Afghanistan because of the evacuation all the way down to designing the new sponsorship program or the new education pathway, which creates a real challenge and bottleneck at administrative level in order to make sure that this political priority can be matched. This is, I think, just a work in progress and a normal process where political priorities are matched with state resources. It always takes a little bit more time, but I think it's a major challenge when the question comes, should we start from one or the other? I think we should also always be mindful that the counterparts we have and the ecosystem as well is relatively small to the size of the challenge. So we need to be mindful of that, and I think be smart in prioritizing and leveraging where the best opportunities exist.
Thank you, Giulio. Fiona, did you want to come in? Otherwise, we've got a few other questions that have come over. So one question that we've received is, and it's built on some of the things that we talked about with, scaling. What can be the limitations of taking complementary pathway projects up to a higher scale? And perhaps I could pose that first to Fiona or Michelle, and then bring everyone else in from the panel.
I think Giulio and Susan answered this earlier, really in relation to the EU and the risk that with scalability comes the stifling of flexibility, and particularly where you're imposing a uniform framework across different member states in the case of the EU. So there are risks that are associated with that. I mean, I think where the EU could help, for example, as Susan said, is operationally in terms of funding and providing support for programmes, but also perhaps in terms of encouraging responsibility sharing in terms of numbers. But that, of course, is a vexed question within the EU and not one that we're going to resolve anytime soon. So whilst I think there is definitely room for scalability, there needs to be the retention of flexibility, as Giulio mentioned earlier, in order to be sure that these programmes adapt and fit each of the contexts in which they're situated.
Thank you, Fiona. Michelle, did you want to add anything to that?
I guess the first thing that jumped to mind was something that Giulio and Mustafa already said around, I mean, and Fiona has reiterated financial requirements, the bureaucratic processes that are slow and limiting, and targets. So, Canada has admits 70,000 permanent residents who have either sought asylum or come through the resettlement program every year. But our international student targets or admissions is in the tens, hundreds of thousands. And that's, I think, similar to other countries. So if refugees can't access those channels, but they are the channels that offer the largest targets and possibly opportunities, we need to fix the barriers that are preventing people from accessing those targets, or adjust the targets for the refugee protection space.
Thank you so much. Please wave the rest of the panel if you want to add to anything on that question. Susan?
Just to reply really briefly, I mean, I would agree with the points that others said. First of all, legal frameworks, of course, when we're talking about student and employment visas being a really critical one. The other one, I would say, which builds on what Michelle just mentioned, is the sort of burden of management of programs, or the amount of facilitations needed around programs. And that comes in part from the legal frameworks, but the more complex legal frameworks are, or processes and requirements are, the more resources are needed on the part of the organizations that are supporting access to these programs and also supporting sponsors. And that then entails additional costs and raises the other challenge that Giulio mentioned earlier, which is, finding sustainable models of funding. And the more funding you need, the more difficult it is to sustain a program. And so one thing I would just point to is the opportunity or the need to look at ways to both sort of lower that burden of management in terms of the frameworks that go around programs, but also I think ways to share resources across programs, both within countries, better coordinating and linking up the organizations that are already working on complementary pathways and sponsorship within particular countries, but also across countries as well, and whether or not there are opportunities to collaborate in terms of the facilitation and networks and outreach that is happening to refugees and first asylum countries as well.
Thanks, Susan. If no one else wants to come in on this specific point, I might pose a question to Mustafa, which is, what is the role of refugee-led initiatives specifically in developing or supporting sponsorship within these complementary pathway programs? I've heard a lot about the importance of empowering refugees through this process, but I'd love to hear a little bit from you about refugee-led initiatives and the role they can play.
The role is huge. I mean, in a way, I think what I'm just trying to think and maybe challenges today that those, the scaling of those programs, or even the buy-in into them, the system phase is actually the refugee exclusion from the formula. While refugee-led organizations and refugee-led initiative, in a way, and maybe kind of we kind of more call it refugee leadership ecosystem. Globally, we're always the first responders. We're always basically the one that doing the hard work on the ground, and then the most of the times the initial work, but then they're not being recognized after that, and they're not being an equal partner after this. And any program, and we've seen that many times, like any kind of a path or program and all of that, it starts with refugee idea, with refugee support and all of that. And then the second it gets scale and then get a bit more of a legs, then that's where a refugee exclusion happened. And then today we are seeing the system, in the simplest way of saying it, is failing for many reasons, but at least one of the major reasons is the exclusion of refugees. So they are already playing a role. I don't think the question whether, what role they are playing, they're already playing the role. They have been always playing that role. They've been always the first to do it. I think, maybe the better question is that I hope to discuss more the role of NGOs and INGOs and governments on how to meaningfully include refugees and harness that role of refugee-led organizations that happening on the ground. Just to give you and maybe kind of an example with the economic mobility pathway, because that's kind of my most experience in it. The two organizations that work in coordination with Talent Beyond Boundaries when they come up with this idea were actually refugee-led organizations. So it was Jumpstart Refugee Talent here in Canada, the organization I was leading, and it was the Refugee Talent in Australia. And both organizations were refugee-led organizations. Work on the ground, and maybe something that many people don't know, the first ever model of data collection on refugees, basically to fill their profile and all of that for the Talent Beyond Boundaries, it was done by Syrian refugees who was in Lebanon. The work in those different places, it was basically refugee-led. But then today, when we talk about the economic mobility pathways, like, I mean, when you start seeing this, with the UNHCR, with other governments and all of that, you barely see the mentioning of basically the role of those refugee-led. And, more disturbingly, that's fine. I mean, we're not in it for recognition. I think at this point, we've got used to it in that sense. But I think at the end, and we shouldn't get used to it. The end of it is that stakeholders need to continue engaging those like refugee leadership ecosystem, and need to utilize it better, because the system can be better. I mean, can only be better in that sense. I mean, even when, imagine when refugees have an ownership and have a partnership, then they buy into it. And when they buy into it, whatever investments the global system have on refugee issues, then the outcome of that investment would be more guaranteed, would be better when I am a believer in what are the resources being provided to me. So yeah, I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I feel, again, to answer your question with a question is that what would be the role of INGOs and stakeholders in government in utilizing and more meaningfully include refugee-led organization, refugee leadership ecosystem.
Thank you, Mustafa, and thank you for highlighting the important role that refugee-led initiatives have played in some of the labour pathways. I think it's really important to highlight that. Michelle, did you want to come in next?
Just quickly to add to what Mustafa was saying, I think Mustafa mentioned about leveraging refugee-led organizations, and I think tied to that is adequately resourcing refugee-led initiatives, refugee-led organizations, finding a way to get funding support to the refugee-led initiatives that often face many barriers in accessing funding because they can't be registered NGOs, et cetera, but we know the important role that they play in sharing information and supporting their peers and accessing these complementary pathways. There's an initiative in Rwanda and in Kenya called Refugee College Guidance Counselors, and they support refugee youth, students, graduates of secondary school to navigate the complicated application processes for scholarships and admissions and how to go about accessing student visas. And I think that's an important role that many refugee youth initiatives play in helping individuals access complementary pathways, not necessarily community sponsorship, although I'm sure that happens informally as well. But I think it's important to recognize the informal networks that are supporting all of this work and finding a way to maximize their impact by providing resources.
Thanks, Michelle. Julia, did you want to come in?
Yeah, just to flag a couple of things, building on what Mustafa has been saying. From my perspective as a community sponsorship, the incredible potential that diaspora organizations and already in-country refugees can play in terms of activating communities to welcome other newcomers is incredible, and is one, I think, of the largest scaling potential for community sponsorship itself, and one that provides, in a way, also refugees that have already arrived and an opportunity for agency within the global refugee regime. So I find it very exciting that, in a way, that is one of the avenues that refugees have in order to gain agency within the refugees, within the global protection regime, and actually offer an additional protection opportunity by creating and structuring sponsoring groups. That, of course, ties up very much in several countries with the opportunities for family unity and family reunification. And I call it family unity in order to distinguish it from the legal framework for family reunification that in several countries is, let's say, legally specific and established. But the opportunity to broaden the concept of family unity by leveraging, by activating refugees already present on the territory in order to create new welcoming groups that are going to welcome family members who are not eligible for traditional family reunification. I think it's an incredible opportunity, again, for both scaling sponsorship, providing agency to refugee newcomers, and broadening the protection space overall. Again, I think it's very important what Michelle was saying, that, and I find it interesting in discussing with several private partners and around the world, that there is a very strong potential interest to support refugee-led initiatives, including in the space of community sponsorship, that is still mismatched vis-a-vis the need that diaspora organizations and refugee-led organizations have in order to provide to reach that support. So there still seems to be there's certainly still a mismatch, at least in Europe, between the availability and the strong interest from private and public funding in order to support refugee-led activation, and the actual arrival of this funding in order to provide that kind of support. And I find, and I would be curious to hear others on it, that one of the challenges is also that the scale of support often can be relatively small for diaspora organizations in order to structure and provide support. And that is not easy to be matched by traditional funding that tries to fund significant amounts. And I found recently that several foundations I've been discussing with are considering smaller grants opportunities in order to provide that kind of activation, that kind of support to diaspora and refugee-led organizations. So just to frame all of this, and indeed, I think this is one of the largest and most interesting frontiers for refugee sponsorship overall, and for the sponsorship and for the refugee ecosystem broad sense. And just again to shout out Hannah, who's joined our team, is also going to be leading this agenda. So she will be certainly joining one of the coming webinars where this is the topic on the agenda.
Thank you, Giulio. I think this sort of also ties in quite nicely to quite a dynamic chat that's happening in the chat box about how to connect refugees to some of these opportunities, be they sponsorship or complementary pathways. I liked Michelle's points about, the role that, for example, refugee-led networks are playing in bridging that gap. But I was wondering if anyone on the panel wanted to add some thoughts on this about how to make some of these pathways more accessible, how to connect refugees with these opportunities more concretely. If there's anything that you wanted to add on this topic.
I think I'll go. That's a very tough question to ask, to answer in a way. Today we're talking about 90 million refugees across the world, and the number will just keep going up. And today, if we think about, this is a crisis. Many research and studies, especially when we start kind of adding the climate change, we're going to have about 1.2 billion refugees by 2050. So it would be the talk of the world at that point. How can refugees access, and this is the unfortunate truth, there is no one recipe. There is no kind of a secret path that, refugees can access this. It's just, it's a long waiting lines in the space of everyone. And then, we always try to do better. I mean, even from my own perspective on how can we make those passes available, or maybe how to increase those passes and come up with new ones every once in a while in that sense. So really, I think, I'm sorry, the answer is that there's no answer, but at least from my own perspective, other than just try to be informed and try to follow. And I think also maybe the only thing I can offer a lot of friends and former refugees and all of that, and this is very, very tough conversation, I do have a lot of time, is that nobody has that kind of a solution. It's just good to keep in mind the perspective that it is a long waiting time. And I think many refugees, and including me, those who were, were the lucky one, we continuously live in that kind of a guilt sense that why us and not the others? Why the one that we stayed here? And then we do a lot of our work because of this, because we always feel that we can do more in that sense. So stay informed, stay connected, stay hopeful as much as possible. It's a very cheesy line. I cannot imagine, or, I understand my family went through it, I went through it, but at the same time, I cannot imagine difficulties that they go on it. And I think that's the only advice, and kind of just manage your expectations in the best way possible. But really, there's no answer for this.
Thank you so much, Mustafa. So Fiona, please go ahead.
No, it was just a quick point, and I noticed that Michelle had put into the chat a website that I was going to mention, or web page that I would mention, that UNHCR has created regarding opportunities within educational pathways, which is an interesting approach in that it's effectively a search that you can do by country and by opportunity. Within the community of people who want to host refugees, I think there's a feeling that there is a lack of mapping or of clarity about which schemes exist. So the UNHCR opportunities website is a very specific example of a specific type of scheme. In my view, there needs to be a much larger scale mapping going on so that people looking for resettlement or complementary pathways opportunities are able very quickly to understand where they exist, who it is that's managing them, what the criteria for different programs are. I mean, fundamentally, we have to overcome the issue that there aren't enough places for the number of people who need them. However, if we can at least start to orientate people in the right direction, that will be a help. At the moment, FJ is involved in an AMI-funded consortium, which is working on various sponsorship initiatives. But within the consortium, a platform is being discussed, which would aim to do that. But it's a massive task. And to be quite honest, a small project cannot hope to achieve that on the global scale that's necessary. So I guess I would make a plea to organisations like UNHCR or better funded organisations to start engaging that process and sharing information in a more systematic fashion so that it's clearer to people who are on the outside of it.
Thank you, Fiona. So we've just received a question which is about the safeguards that need to be in place to protect the integrity of complementary pathways. So this question is about what safeguards need to be in place to prevent unscrupulous immigration consultants from charging excessive consultation fees for refugees to access complementary pathways. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to weigh in on this, how to make sure that refugees aren't crowded out from accessing alternative protection pathways, and also what safeguards need to be in place to manage that access. And if no one wants to answer, I'll call on Susan or Michelle.
I can just come in briefly and then happy to turn it over to Michelle. I was just going to say one of the things I think that's important is what we've heard earlier, which is around having some sort of support network training available for sponsors themselves. And making sure that sponsors know what their responsibilities are and sort of, how not to overstep boundaries. And then also, one of the things that I think is crucial in community sponsorship more broadly, but also particularly within complementary pathways, when we're talking about sort of the post-arrival piece, is making sure there is some sort of safety net. And this is, potentially a challenge within the use of things like employer and student visas, because there may be rules around accessing public benefits, but ensuring that if there is a situation where the sponsor support breaks down, that there are alternative ways and places that individuals can receive that support in some way is really important. And then, of course, the final piece is, protection from refoulement, which again is a risk in some times when someone's traveling on a non-humanitarian protection pathway. And ideally, that's provided by the asylum system. But we're looking at different contexts in which student visas or employment visas or other types of visas can be used. Sometimes the asylum system isn't always extremely accessible, and the United States is an excellent example of this, where the asylum system is incredibly backlogged. And sure, someone could apply for asylum as a way to have permanent access to permanent residency in the United States, but it's going to take years. It will influence their ability to benefit from and apply for other types of programs. So making sure that there's support network for sponsors, and then the safety net question, I think, is something that comes back to coordination with governments in some way, and really can't be addressed by programs themselves alone.
Thank you, Susan. Michelle, did you want to come in?
Sure. I'm glad that Susan covered all of the safeguarding and protection concerns on the receiving country side, and I agree with everything that you said. One of my biggest sources of concern, I guess, is the potential for exploitation in first countries of asylum. And I think the question has disappeared, but I think one of the questions was around consultants and exploiting and requiring fees and whatnot. And I think when we do our call for applications, having transparent and open processes that specify that there are no fees associated with applying for the program, ensuring that the important partners that work with youth, in our case, and this is transferable to other pathways as well, those that work with the target populations are aware of the initiative, and that also there's no fee. Having a whistleblowing at the risk of, or for a lack of better words, like a place where individuals can report any attempts at exploitation. But I think it's a real concern. We have an established program that is well known in very protracted refugee situations. So most camp populations already know about our program, and there's still exploitation of individuals in those contexts. So I can only imagine new initiatives that are less well known, the potential for things to go awry.
Mustafa?
And that also brings me back to an amazing, or like a great way to one more reason why a partnership with refugee-led organizations and both ends would be very critical and very crucial in that sense, because that would definitely safeguard. There was a research that done by Alex Pett and I can't remember the other one, but in Oxford, where, for example, in Kenya, when they did about more than 92% of refugees, when they faced an issue, they went to refugee-led organization first before going to any other organization, that kind of a community. And I think this is one of the ways where we ensure, that kind of a partnership with refugee-led organization on both ends, whether in the receiving end or in the hosting countries, that the refugee-led organization would play the role of the verifier. And definitely, I'm not saying like, because a lot of people come to me is like, wake up and there was like 1,000 refugee-led organizations. I'm not saying go and partner with 1,000 refugee-led organizations, but there are a well-established, reputable refugee-led organization in different spaces. And yes, they do exist if people think they don't. So they can, a partnership with those organizations would definitely verify, would reduce tremendously the fraud, would safeguard a lot of that. And at the same time, will make NGOs and INGOs stand out in terms of their work and how genuine their work is. We've seen, and even like on the complementary pathways, every time there's a new kind of idea or new complementary pathway, then you start seeing many organizations start thinking about this as kind of a source of asking for funding and all of that. So rather than just going and supporting what exists and then building on it, then you start seeing also kind of that many new faces and new names and new organizations and all of that coming up. But I think, and there's nothing wrong about this in some ways, but I think what distinguish, and hopefully the world and the NGOs and all of that getting used to the point that, having that partnership, the meaningful partnership with refugee, not kind of a checking the box, with refugee-led and refugee leadership ecosystem, what would make this more legitimate and what would reduce a lot of chances for a fraud and basically safeguard this. There will be no way that this will be 100% safe, but absolutely this kind of strategy would make it a lot more effective.
Thank you, Mustafa. I'm aware that we're running quite close to the end of the webinar. So Julia, did you want to come in very quickly on this? Or do you want to save your thoughts?
It's just 1 minute just to say one thing that Susan said super important about the last part of her sentence when she spoke about the risk of sponsorship breakdown and how do we address that risk. This is a critical piece of sponsorship design around the world, because it's where the risk taking by the government is most significant, of course, because then often it's the government or the leading organizations that need to take up the responsibility so that the refugees continue to be assisted. And I just wanted to point at the incredible innovation of the Shapiro Fund in the UK that has been established in order specifically to support sponsorship organizations to fund in case of sponsorship breakdown by relying on an insurance model that will provide them with amounts of money that cover the cost of covering the sponsorship breakdown. So I just wanted to point at that innovation as a great financial example that speaks as to the innovative financial models that we can build in the sponsorship ecosystem overall. So voila, stop it here, Kate, thanks.
Thank you so much, Julia. So we've had so many really rich insights during the course of this discussion, and I just want to close with one last lightning round of questions to the panelists. What do you think the sort of future of sponsorship is within Complementary Pathways, and what is on your wish list in terms of policy changes or support to make this happen? And if you just offer 1 or 2 points each, that would be great. And I might start with Fiona.
Okay, quick fire response then. Obviously, my wish list is for Italy in particular, and for a structured system of community sponsorship to be in place. And that's something that we're working on at the moment. There are various challenges associated with that. But what I can say is that the informal discussions that we've had about the model that we're proposing with NGOs, with INGOs, with parliamentarians are at the moment positive. So we will move forward with this in the hope that we can find a more structured pathway for Italy.
Thank you, Fiona. Michelle, I'll turn to you next.
I think I'll reiterate a couple of things that I've already said. So unlocking, in terms of policy priorities, I would say unlocking the barriers or removing the barriers that are preventing refugees from accessing non-refugee protection pathways to immigration, study visas, work visas, and doing it as quickly as possible so that we can maximize those pathways as quickly as possible to achieve our 2 million target of complementary pathways offered by 2028. I think naming is an important component to community sponsorship models. So those who don't already offer naming as an opportunity, I am an advocate of that. And then I think, as has been pointed out by others, I think leveraging the community sponsorship models to mobilize new communities within that. So higher education communities, workplaces, students, sports organizations, et cetera. And these are some of the things that we'll be working on in a couple of months and years to follow.
Thank you, Michelle. Julia, I'm going to call on you next.
I'll be super fast and I will respond to 2% with 2 percentages. I would love to reach 10%, so half of the 20% of people that would be ready to join community sponsorship in 10 years. So if we would get to 10% in 10 years, I would be really happy. And the second thing is 50%, so that at least half the complementary pathways that we are developing are supported by sponsor groups. So those would be my two overarching targets and hopes for the coming years of work. And off to you, Kate.
Thank you. Mustafa, would you like to go next?
I think that the first one is definitely the increase of resettlement through maybe government and policymakers and bureaucrats utilizing the fact that we are in 2021 and then we have so many tools to make things faster when it comes to processing times and all of that, and hopefully that would increase. The second one is really kind of something Canada has done first time, which institutionalizing refugee participation within the policymaking and commitment of governments. Something that Canada has done for the first time in history, and we're too late for that, and that's kind of the work of our seat right now, working with 20 other governments, is that where government makes it institutional, makes it normal, a common practice to include refugees and their policy makings and their responses, and also to include, to utilize refugees in improving those processes and increasing those numbers in that sense. So basically, definitely to work with them. Those are the two things on my wish list.
Thank you. And then last but not least, Susan.
Also super quick, and I think I would come back to the point I said at the beginning in terms of what the future holds, which is that the relationship between sponsorship when we're talking about welcome and integration and sponsorship and complementary pathways is very natural, and I see it only continuing to grow. As everyone has said, I think this is in many ways where the future of humanitarian pathways lies in terms of growth. But as we embark on that journey, one of my fears is that as interest and focus in this area grows, that we'll lose some of the creativity that has really enabled this sector to become an important player, and some of the flexibility. And what I would want to see is that the sector as a whole, whether we're talking about the international level or the national level, doesn't end up limited to one kind of model or too stringent of frameworks around these models, but that it continues to maintain flexibility both in terms of across countries and also within programs themselves, and how we're thinking about how sponsorship can be adapted to different contexts. So really maintaining flexibility and not becoming sort of overly constrained in our thinking about what is possible and who should be engaged.
Thank you, Susan. Well, thank you all for such a rich and insightful discussion. I'm going to hand things back to Eliza, who will wrap up the conversation.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much to Kate for her brilliant moderation. Thank you to our wonderful presenters, Julio, Susan, Mustafa, Fiona, and Michelle. I've learned so much from the conversation this morning, and I know that everybody else on the line has as well. Thank you for giving us your time and your wisdom. I'd like to quickly thank the Alex Trebek Forum for Dialogue for supporting our research colloquium. And last but very much not least, I'd like to thank the wonderful team at MPI and also at the Refugee Hub for coordinating and helping to think through this session with me. You've all done wonderful work and I thank you very much. Super quickly, we have another workshop coming up on November the 19th. That's a Friday at 9 a.m. Eastern. This workshop will focus on innovations in sponsorship research and will feature the new projects and upcoming research papers and events for different sponsorship researchers from around the world. So that invitation will be going out in the next few days. I really hope you can join us for that one. And as always, you can follow us on @RefugeeHub on Twitter if you want more information about this series generally. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a lovely day. Take care.